Okay, so it is 9:02, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Salmon and I'm the Research Services Librarian here at UC Merced. And I also serve as the liaison to the Sociology, Public Health, and Political Science departments. And so we have a nice sized group with us today. So if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat. And my colleague Kelly Abrasi is here helping me monitor any questions that come in. And so we'll pause throughout the presentation to address any of your questions or concerns. So today we are going to start out with a broad overview of the different types of data, who is producing this data, and then where secondary data is typically made available. Then we're going to move on to access issues and various search pathways for locating secondary data. So starting off at that bird's eye view, what is data? So generally speaking, data is a value assigned to a thing. And so for our purposes, we're going to break that into two categories where we have our raw data, which is the output or measurement of an observation. And we may encounter that as quantitative data, qualitative or geospatial data. And then our data might be presented as statistics. And so that's going to be the output after we analyze our raw data. And so we might encounter that as a table, summaries, or graphical representations. Although today we are generally going to be talking about quantitative tabular data, we're also going to encounter these other types along the way. And so we can also categorize our data as primary data and secondary data. And so our primary data is going to be that new data, which is typically collected to answer a specific question or serve a specific need. And so through this intentional design, there is this known universe, so a known population and geographies that the original data collectors are closely acquainted with. Now with secondary data, that is going to be our recycled data. So it's collected by others and reused. Sometimes, but not always, it's obtained for a different use or to respond to a different research question. And the secondary data users are going to be reliant on metadata and documentation. And so today we are going to be searching for this primary data to use for our secondary analysis. So some advantages to using secondary data are cost and time. And so the original data collector bears these burdens. Secondary data collection can also be used for comparability or reproducibility purposes. So you might be comparing or contrasting your results with other using same or similar data sources. The data that was originally collected may address points in time or geographies that are not directly available to you as the researcher. And in a similar manner, the data may address populations not accessible to the researcher as well. And especially during right now where a lot of research has been halted because of the pandemic, this might be really one reason to pursue secondary data analyses in order to access the data that is just not currently available to you. And then there's also the concept of authority. And so the original data collectors may have had specific training or knowledge related to their data collection that you might not have available to you. So some disadvantages, though, of using secondary data might have to do with the data documentation that is available. And so as you go through this process of locating secondary data, you might find that the data documentation is incomplete, or some of that design might be unknown or just undocumented. The quality of the data elements may vary dramatically. And then if there were any data collection challenges, they may be difficult for you to ascertain. The data, because it will be typically collected or gathered for different purposes, it may be presented in a way that is hard for you to use then to answer your own research questions. You'll also want to make sure the data is the correct currency, so you don't want to end up using outdated data. And then you also might come across data that is proprietary or restricted in some way. So it's possible there may be a cost to accessing this data, or there might be some other availability obstacles that you might encounter. So where does this data come from? So the secondary data that we're going to be trying to locate today is going to emerge from three kinds of collection processes. So we have our design data, and that includes data that was intentionally collected either through surveys or other experimental designs. We have our administrative data, which is collected for program administration or routine record keeping. And so with administrative data, sometimes I think of government data or NGO or IGO data that is out there, like aid organizations, possibly like UN data, government data. And then we have our digital exhaust. So this is an electronic byproduct or residue of activities. And so when I think of Google searches or Facebook or social media data, I'm thinking of that digital exhaust data. And then we're also going to be coming across our data as either cross-sectional or longitudinal. We might be able to access our data at the micro level where we have individual levels, or we might be presented with our data as summary counts or statistics. So I am going to just take a pause to see if any questions have come in. But I am seeing some research interests that people have put in the chat. So great, thank you for doing that. I should also mention that I can make these slides available if folks are interested. Once we get into the section of locating data, I'm going to be sharing a few different resources to help you get started with your data search. Okay, yay, thank you, Alana. We got some positive feedback for recording and sharing slides. Of course, happy to do it. Okay, so moving on to locating data. So as you start your search, you're going to want to consider a few different things before you start getting into some of the data search tools and repositories. And so one you'll want to consider is the data likely to have been collected? Who might have been interested in collecting this data? Who has the authority and really the capability to collect the data? And then is there a reason this data would be shared? And so it's possible that as a researcher, as part of publishing an article, you might be responsible for also making sure that your data and your processes are transparent and available to other researchers. And then if the data is shared, where and how would the data likely be shared? And then again, is the data going to be available to you? And so we're going to take a closer look at two of these points. So who is interested in collecting the data and who has the authority and ability to collect data? And that's going to bring us to our major data producers. So we have government agencies, intergovernmental agencies, and that includes things like the UN. And so the UN has a data portal, the World Bank also has a data portal. Non-government agencies and think tanks, corporate entities, research organizations, and then researchers. And so when we think of these data producers, we can try to associate them with specific data locations. And so if you are expecting a government agency to be one of your data producers, then you might decide then one of your first steps in your research process is going to be go and see if you can access through a government website or a government data portal. Now, you might also be able to locate the data in subscription databases or memberships, and these are typically at the institutional level. And so that's going to bring us into exploring some library resources that are available to you. Now, you also may be able to locate your data in repositories or data archives, and these tend to be used interchangeably. Both of them are locations for storing data. The main difference between data repositories and data archives is that with data archives, there's also a preservation component in addition to the data storage. And so this data will hopefully be available for the long term despite its original form. We might be able to locate data through journal articles, and then it is possible that data exists, but it is in non-public locations for various reasons. And so I now want to move over to our search pathways. And so I have another series of questions here, but you probably will not know the answer to these questions without some preliminary exploration. And so these pathways can be related back to identifying who your data producers are and their associated common data locations. And I have to be honest, this can get a little muddy here because this is just not always a very distinct process. You might have data living in a few different places or accessed through a few different pathways. And so again, some things to consider is if the data is produced or you're expecting it to be produced by a government entity or organization, you can consider searching the web. And there's some ways that you can be a little bit more targeted with your web searching, either through domain searching or customized search tools. And there are also curated lists of government entities and other IGO, NGO organizations that I'll be sharing with you that actually one of my colleagues at UC Berkeley created, who is on the call. So he has some beautiful guides that I'll be sharing. And then is the data associated with a publication? So it's possible you came across an article that looked really helpful and you want to track down that author's original data. And so it's possible that article might provide a data citation. And then you should feel comfortable. Well, I shouldn't say you should feel comfortable. There is the option of, if the researcher is still accessible or able to be contacted, you can reach out to them to see if they have their data in some kind of format that could possibly be shared. And then finally, is the data archived in a repository? And so there's a few different ways that we can get at data that is in repositories. So we can use a data set search tool that searches across multiple repositories. We can go into a specific repository, or we could also use repository search tools as well. And then I also wanted to point out the libraries at all of our campuses provide a large list of databases. And typically you're going to be able to refine your database search results by limiting to just viewing statistics and data set resources that are available to you. And sometimes these statistics and data set resources are things that are associated with those institutional subscriptions, and other times they are just resources that have been pulled into the database listing because we think they're going to be helpful for you in your search. Okay, and so as we go through this process, I just wanted to pause and talk about the levels of access that you are going to encounter as you're looking for secondary data. And so in many cases, your repositories are going to be open or freely available to you. And so when you are searching government, IGO, NGOs, and some research organizations, the majority of repositories and archives will typically have data that is open or freely available. You may also come across data that is contained in those fee-based or subscription databases. This might also technically be a membership associate or an association membership where the data and data set access is paid for by either your subscription or membership. And so an example of this would be something like the Data Citation Index or ICPSR. And then again, this is another area where things can get a little bit muddy because some of the data within ICPSR is only available to members, but then some of it is open as well. You may also come across restricted data. This could possibly be data that is technically freely available or data that is available through a subscription. However, because of the sensitive nature of this data, you may need to apply for access. And so this brings to mind data that contains potentially identifying information. And so in these cases, you might need to contact the vendor or go through an application process where you explain your methods for data security. You might have to present IRB approval during this process as well. And then we have closed data, which is not available for external access. And then finally, you may come across embargoed data, so data that exists, but it's not going to be available until after a certain period of time. Now, I also wanted to mention here that with all of these different levels of access that you may encounter when using data search tools or repositories, you may also be prompted to create an account within that repository in order to access those downloadable files. This is something that a lot of repositories require, and I suspect it helps them keep track of who is using the tools and some of the reasoning behind that. So for example, when you use a repository like ICPSR, you're going to be encouraged to create your own account as well, even though this is a membership subscribed database. Okay, so I wanted to get a little bit more into our search pathways and go through some examples with you. And so for our targeted web searching, likely this is going to be the most familiar pathway. There are a few ways that you can be a little bit more focused. And the first suggestion or strategy is using domain searching. For example, you can add a specific domain in association with your keywords. And then that's just going to limit your search results to those specific domains. And if you are working with internationally focused topics, you may also try searching in another country's Google domain as well. And so in this example here, I have healthcare data, and I'm limiting this to just Canadian sites here. And so I just have my keywords within my search, and then I just have site:.ca. And so I can see that I'm getting a few different sources here. Some look useful, some look like maybe they're not going to be providing me with the secondary data that I need. I'm going to go into this first one here. And so I can see this is from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. It looks like I have a way to access data and reports here. I think I might a little bit down here too. So I have two places that I could potentially explore at this point. So I'm going to come into this first one. And I actually have a lot of different ways that I can filter my results on the side. So I have my themes and my geographies, and then they're also presented to me within this middle area as well. So quick stats, those are going to be those aggregate data points. And then it looks like I have a few other routes that I could pursue here as well. I'm actually going to go into one of these. And okay, so I could definitely start going down the rabbit hole here. And so in this case, I sort of have a description of what was being collected in the research questions. There's some key findings from the report, and then over here on this side, I can access those data tables. So this is actually presented really nicely. That's not always the case as you go through this process. And so I'm just going to go back out of here to our data search. And so you could play around with this as too, if say you were interested in also looking at US government sites too, we could change this to .gov as well. There is also, if you were looking for non-government agencies, there is a custom search tool that was created by a few different libraries. And so this is a search tool. It doesn't look that great, but it kind of works. I think it depends on what you are looking for. So let's see what we can bring up here. Okay, so we're getting some things that are coming up. So this is limiting sort of to a domain search that is a .org search, but it's also searching across a specific set of NGOs and IGOs that have been put together by the libraries that are working on this customized Google search. And so I can see here there are some things coming in from the World Bank, something coming in from this childfund.org organization, and I can kind of scroll down. I can see that my keywords are bolded here. Now, something that I think is useful about this Google customized search is it can give you an indication of what is out there, but you can see here there's really no ways to filter these results or refine them in any way. This is sort of, I get what I get within this site. And then I wanted to go and point out some of these resources that have been compiled by UC Berkeley. And so the first is a list of IGO sources. And so there are some key government databases that are listed in the middle. So we have, say, our OECD data, our UN data. And so there's a lot of different data portals here. And then we also are provided by UC Berkeley a list of NGO organizations. And these are really great places to start out, read the descriptions and see if they align with your research interests as well. So I wanted to move on to just talking about library resources. And so I had mentioned you may come across a publication that cites your data. And then some of our search tools that are available to you may allow you to search for accompanying data sets as well. And so an example of that potentially could be the Web of Science database. So I'm going to bring this up. And so again, if you're accessing any of these databases from off campus, you will want to make sure you're connected to your campus's VPN or your web proxy. And so I'm just going to peek at some of our research interests over on the side. And so in this case, of course, this was a really broad search. And so I would likely need to narrow this down in a few different ways. But I do have the option over here to filter my results by associated data. And so now I'm going to refine. Now I do have to say, as I have gone through some of these data sets, some of these will provide you with tabular data that is going to be available to you for download. And then some are also going to provide you with aggregate data. So, you know, this looks really promising to me. It looks like I have maybe 96 things to explore. But as I get in, I might find that some of these are just linking out to the Figshare repository, and I'm just getting some of those graphical representations of data. But I think this could be an interesting place to start if you were looking for some specific publications to spark some creativity or stimulate some different ways that you could pursue looking for secondary data. I also wanted to point out, I had mentioned before that through your campus's library database list, you should be able to identify what resources are available to you and then what resources have been pulled in that could be potentially helpful for your data search. And so we can just take a look at UCLA's database A to Z list here. So again, we have, 1,000+ databases, but if I go over to content types, I can make this a little bit more narrow and look at the sources that are going to provide me with data and statistics. And so again, similar to those resources that I showed you from UC Berkeley, you'll want to read through these different descriptions to see what aligns with your research questions. And then you can also put in some keywords up here too. So I don't know, oh, that did not work for me. So I'm wondering I'm just going to leave it as that. We'll go back and I would say come through and you can read through some of these. You may be able to do a more successful keyword search than I can based on what you're looking for. Again, some of these are going to provide you with that tabular raw data, and then some of these, such as like data planet statistics, are going to provide you with that aggregate data. And so we have something really similar available to us at UC Merced again, where we have this drop down with all database types, and then we can go to our statistics and data set databases. And then if I wanted to, I could do a keyword search. And in our case, we can narrow things down by subject as well. And so that's going to update things a little bit for us. So I want to move on now to some of the data set search tools. And so these are going to be the search tools that are available to you where you are searching across repositories. And so when you're searching for your data set in this way, you're going to be doing keyword searches that are more closely related to the interest that you have or the topic that you're hoping to locate secondary data on. So the first tool that I wanted to show you is DataCite. And so this is a large index of research data, and it's compiled across 1,000 different repositories, including some major repositories such as the Harvard Dataverse, ICPSR, and Dryad. Dryad, if you're not familiar, is the repository that is used at University of California, as well as other institutions and organizations as well. I'm gonna go into DataCite. Let's see if we can make this work this time. And we're actually going to come back here because there's two tools that you can access that I think will be helpful. But the first one we're going to do is search the registry to find databases. And then we'll come back to the re3data.org in just a moment. Okay, so we're just provided with this single line here. And I'll do a search again for discrimination. This is bringing up a lot of results. So let's see if I can tie that together with someone's suggested topic of inequality as well. Okay, a little bit more refined here. So DataCite is set up a little bit differently than a lot of our databases, but typically it's the same where we have our search bar, our results in the middle, and then ways that we can refine. Usually you see this on the left-hand side, but in DataCite we're seeing it on the right. So registration year has to do with the year that the data or the resource was ingested into this repository. So you'll still want to read through the description of the item to make sure it aligns with your currency needs. Under resource types, in the very beginning, I had mentioned that you may encounter qualitative data or geospatial data. We're going to see those within DataCite as well. And I'm going to say that I'm interested in looking at a data set. So I can limit that some more too. So at this point, I can begin exploring some of these things if they look interesting to me. And I can, getting some things here, I can sort of see my author's information, and then I can see some information about what repository DataCite is pulling this result from. And so, see, let's go into, we'll just go into this one right here to see what we can find. Okay, so we have more of our description here. I'm getting my repository info over here, so I can see that this is something from USC's digital library, so from their repository. But in order to actually access this item, I'm going to click on the DOI down below. Okay, and so this is bringing us to this here, and this does look like this is a thesis presentation, or I'm sorry, a thesis document. And I don't if this is actually going to have the data that I am looking for. And so I would need to scroll through and just become more familiar with the contents here. And so this item is not as straightforward, but it has some potential use. I would just need to spend more time with it. So I'm gonna, whoops, sorry about that. Go back to our data site results. And this time I'm going to go into another repository that we're being provided some results for, which is the Harvard Dataverse. And we'll spend a little bit more time in there in just a second. I'm going to go into this one. I feel like this might be a little bit more promising for finding that tabular data because I have information that this is related to replication data here. Again, what I want to do is click on the DOI down below, and this should kick me over to where this data actually lives in the Harvard Dataverse. So I am getting some more information, which is great. I'm being provided with the related publication. And then I can see below which files are available to me. So I have the data file here, and then there's another zip file as well. Sometimes you have the option to preview things before you go ahead and download them. So that can be useful to become just a little bit more familiar with what you're going to get out of this data set. Some repositories like ICPSR provide you with some ways to manipulate the data and get some quick stats out. And it looks like Harvard Dataverse does that as well. Sometimes this function is not available for every single data set that you might find in this repository. I think I would have to download this file, and it looks like I have a few different formats for downloading this. And then I would have to unzip the file to really see what additional documentation is available for me that's coming from this package. The last dataset search tool that I wanted to point out is Google Dataset Search. This is in beta. And so let's just continue with our discrimination. And inequality search. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how this the same search terms are eliciting different results depending on what data tool we use. And so we have a couple ways that we can filter these results by last updated, the download formats that are available, usage rights, and that's typically commercial or non-commercial. And then we have some ways that we can filter by topic too. So I'm just going to say we're interested in the social sciences. Again, when I'm looking at this, I can see that it's very likely some of these are going to provide me with aggregate data like this from Statistica. And then I can see some other repositories that I'm somewhat familiar with here, like Figshare, and actually a lot from Statistica. So anyhow, at this point, if this was something I wanted to access, I could click through again. So as you go through this process, you're going to be sort of trying to figure out where to click and what that is going to take you to. I'll say that seems fine. Oh goodness, okay. And so I can see what data is being presented to me here. So this is in aggregate data, kind of curious. Okay, that just kind of gives me my information about my chart here. And then I have some other information over here on the side. So I can see, okay, so this is survey responses that was collected between June 10th and 20th with a little over 1,300 responses. It's an online survey. And then I can download this graph here as a PDF, Excel, image, or PowerPoint file. So within this point, this is sort of what I'm going to be able to get from this site. Now, if I go back to our data set search and see, I'm wondering what's available within this Figshare. Again, so this does look like this is going to be an Excel file available to me. So I'm just going to click through again. And now I am over here. And so I'm getting some more information than I was presented to through the Google dataset search. And so again, I would want to see, oops, I'm actually downloading that, whoops. And so that's going to open up as an Excel file for me. And it looks like it's going to be presented as a table. Okay. But I would need to explore this a little bit more, and it looks like this is going to link me to the publication that is associated with this data. So I want to move on to data repositories. And so there's a few different reasons why you may want to go directly into a repository and not start your search using the specific data set search tools that I just went over. And so some of the reasons are that depending on what repository you use, you might be able to browse collections a little bit more freely than you can do when you're just searching for something very specifically. And so by browsing collections, you can become more familiar with what data is out there, and that can help you figure out which secondary data would be appropriate for your research question. So you have your browsability, and then some of our data repositories are going to provide you with a lot of additional information that can be helpful as you're making decisions about secondary data as well. So when we were initially looking at the Canadian healthcare site and we sort of clicked through, we had, you know, that report, we had some really nice data files that we could download. And so we're going to find that in some of our repositories as well. We're going to get a lot of information about how the data was collected. We'll get full data documentation. And with some of our databases, we'll know that the data has been cleaned up and is being made available specifically for secondary use. So some of those concerns that I mentioned with our secondary data disadvantages about maybe lack of documentation, data may be coded in a way that you won't be able to use. Hopefully, if you're able to identify a repository that meets your needs, you can bypass some of those disadvantages. And so the R3 data tool is also accessible from the DataCite platform. And this is going to allow me to search data repositories. And so I'm going to be a little bit more broad in my search here, not as specific. So I'm just going to do a search for education. And now this is going to show me repositories that contain education data and education resource types. And so over here on the side, I have a lot of different ways that I can filter through my results. I'm trying to see if I'm provided with the number of results I have right now. Okay, so 264 potential repositories for me to visit. And you'll see, like, as we go through these, some of these are bringing in government websites as well, such as the National Center for Education Statistics. And so with my subjects here, there are a lot of different ways that I can filter through. And so I might say, you know what, I'm very just interested in looking at things related to education sciences. And I know when I click on this, I'm going to refine my results. So now I'm just looking at 59 different repositories that I may be interested in exploring. Again, this is just an index. So if I would like to go to the National Center for Education Statistics, I'm going to have to click through and getting some information here. And then I'm going to click through again. And so at this point, similar to how we were on the Canadian healthcare site, I'm now looking for things on this website that have to do with data, sometimes data sets, sometimes, you know, this might be labeled as reports too. And so I'm going to go and click through. And then we have a lot of different ways here that we can continue to explore this data. Another list that you might find helpful if you are looking to locate a repository directly is the OA directory. And this is something that has been created by Simmons College. And so this is an ongoing list of available data repositories. They are open access, so you can at least search these data repositories, although you, again, might have to make that free account in order to download some of your data. And it's also possible there might be a component where you do need to have a subscription or membership as well. And so you can see that these are divided by subject areas. And so I did want to call out that, you know, there are repositories that are specific to a subject, but you might also be interested in exploring some of these multidisciplinary repositories as well. And so Dryad, for example, is a multidisciplinary repository. Harvard Dataverse is also a multidisciplinary repository. And then if we go down, we have some repositories that are just specific to the social sciences. So I'm going to go back, and I realized there was one thing on the previous slide that I did intend to show you, which was the OpenAIRE dataset search tool. And so this is a search tool that's harvesting research output from various journals and also various repositories as well. And this is linked to the Zenodo data repository, which is multidisciplinary, but also tends to have a science focus as well. And so when you're searching this repository, again, we're searching at the data set level. And what I want to do is change this from all content to research outcomes. And then if I'm specifically looking for research data, I'm going to leave that as my only item selected. And then I can say that I'm interested in everything that's available or interested in the things that are just available through open access. So I'm just going to do a search related to elections. I was working with a political science class recently. And so this is a site that is based in the EU. However, it has farther reach, but a little bit of an EU focus. So I can see here, again, I'm looking at a lot of different research outcomes here that have data associated with them. So I'd want to narrow that down. And so I could, by narrowing the type of research outcome, which is my research data, and I want to say I'm looking for a data set. There's different languages that these are going to appear in. And so there's a few different ways that I can go through. And then again, this is just more of an index where I would want to click through. And then if I'm able to find the DOI, which is right down here, I'm going to click through again. And so this is actually bringing me into a repository. It's a multidisciplinary repository that's associated with Mendeley. And so at this point, I have the option to download my data files here as well. And hopefully I have some documentation in there. And that's not actually clear at this point until I download the files to see what's in there. Okay, so sorry about that. And so to wrap up, we have about 15 minutes left. What I would like to do is spend a tiny bit of time in some more specific repositories. And so I had mentioned ICPSR a few times. This is a repository that is, I think it's considered the world's largest repository for political and social sciences data. And I want to say the acronym, so it's at the bottom maybe? Nope. Let's see, Intercollegiate Political Science and Social Research. I think I'm getting that wrong. So I apologize for that. The acronym sort of rolls off my tongue at this point. So once we are in a repository here, we actually have a few different ways we can go about locating data. So we have this search bar up here. And so I'm going to do a search, and the way that my results are going to display are, I have the default is my study level. And so what I'm being presented here are different studies that are related to the keywords that I used as my search terms. I also can click over to the next tab, and this is going to give me specific variables that are related to my search terms. This series tab is going to represent my longitudinal data that's available. I can also access data-related publications, and then ICPSR website is more of just a general website search as well. And I'm going to go back to this studies bar, studies tab up here. And so if I want, I can further refine, by looking at some of these subject terms that are available to me. I can also limit by geography. Restriction type, that has to do with whether this data is available publicly or if there are some restrictions associated with it. Now with the format here, ICPSR does a really great job of providing you your data files in a lot of different format types. And if you are interested in a format that is not available, they are receptive if you were to email them and see if you could obtain something in a different format. And then this online analysis tool is similar to that tool we saw in the Harvard Dataverse, where you can get some quick stats from the data that is available. Collection method, it's pretty straightforward there. And then data type, that's going to be your quantitative versus qualitative. And you can see here, there are sort of all different ways that you can filter through your data here. With ICPSR, it's very likely you're going to be prompted to log in. The UCs do have a membership to ICPSR, so the first time you log in or create your account, you will want to be connected to your VPN or web proxy. So you make that connection for ICPSR that you are part of a membership institution. But then after that, typically you can just come here without being on the VPN and log in directly. So I'm going to go into one of these, and I'm actually going to change my sort to bring up a more recent release here. Okay. I'm just going to go into the Household Economics and Decision-Making Survey. So again, we get a project description here, and then we have our tabbed results. And so these are pretty similar to what we just saw in our results listing too. So through our data and documentation, I see that I have this file here, then I can get a preview, and this is going to give me my code book and my questionnaire, which can be really helpful. And then I can go ahead and download the data that is associated with this. I can also get a snapshot of the variables that I'm going to see once I download the data, and I am getting some additional information here. I'm getting a description and some data type info. And then I can also explore some of the publications that have relied on this data here. This is not always comprehensive. There might be other publications out there, but this is what has been linked towards this record. So something else about using repositories directly is some of them, including ICPSR, provide you with the option to browse data through thematic collections. And so under Find Data through here, I'm going to go through and just access those thematic collections. And so if we go more into one of these, the search functionality is going to be the same as just what we saw in ICPSR, but we're going to be searching a smaller and more focused collection. So I'm going to go into this one for data sharing for demographic research. And so this just gives me some more information about the project here and how this data was collected and some associated initiatives. And then I can go over and I can search the holdings as well. And it looks like I'm sort of being suggested. I can either do a browse by these subject types, I can do a keyword search, I can view all studies. So there's a lot of different access points here. I'm just gonna go into this first one. That way you can see that this is set up is really familiar to what we just saw in ICPSR. The next data repository that I wanted to highlight is the Harvard Dataverse. And so this is the institutional repository that is associated with Harvard, but it also has much broader data collection that you'll find in here. I did not explain that very well. So this is going to contain data collections that are well beyond Harvard. This is a very frequently used data repository. But one thing I wanted to point out here is I also have the option to browse by subject as well. And so I'm going to go into the collections that is based on the social sciences here. And so again, this is another great way to explore data when you're not quite sure what is out there or how you want to focus your projects. And so similar to what we have seen in our other search tools and repositories, our results are in the middle here. I can do a more targeted keyword search, and then I have ways that I can further refine my results on this side. And then the last repository I wanted to go into is the Council of European Social Sciences Data Archives. This also has a broader scope than just European data. And then through here, I can access the data catalog. And so this is sort of populating everything in the middle for me. And again, I can go through and make some selections based on what I am looking for. And I can do that within here as well. And so I'm getting some information, so we can go into this first one. It is possible this is in a language that I do not read, which is okay. I would need to limit that if that seemed to be the case. But again, I have this information here, and then I would click up here on the top to then go over and access the data. So again, you're going to experience a decent amount of clicking and exploring some of these pages as you get into this process. So I know that we just sort of did a whirlwind tour of different pathways for locating secondary data. And so I was curious if there are any questions that folks may have. Feel free to unmute, or you can also put your questions into the chat. Thank you, Kelly. The Inter-University Consortium for Politics and Social Research. I appreciate that. I just could not remember that exact acronym. Yes, so what I'm going to do is after this session, I am going to share this presentation with everyone that's attended, but I can also share my Google slide deck with you as well. And so I can put that into the chat in just a second. And I apologize. Okay, so I just put the slide deck into the chat, and so this is view only. If you do have any questions that pop into your head after today's session, feel free to reach out to me. I also am planning to put together a resource that contains your local context for this information. So whether it's your social science liaison or your data librarian on your campus that can help you with your secondary data search. And so I hope to have that together within just a few days, and I'll email that to everyone that joined us on this Zoom call. I also wanted to mention, check out some of the other workshops that are taking place this week. So I believe that there is going to be a deep dive into using ICPSR. So if that looked helpful to you, be sure to tune into that. And I'm hoping that, a lot of these workshops, the materials are going to be made available and recorded. So you can also, if you can't make something, you can refer back to at a later point. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great week. And Kelly has put some things into the chat. So she put in the link for the UC Data Love or UC Love Data Week.
Excuse me.
Yes.
So a lot of us are getting an access denied message for the slide deck.
Oh, how about that? Thank you for letting me know. Let's see if I can change that. Okay, Jessica, thank you for bringing that to my attention. So if this link that I'm putting into the chat right now does not work, I'll be sure, I'll just email that PDF that I was using to everyone as well. That way there won't be any access issues. Oh, good. I'm getting some indications that it worked. Great. Okay, everyone. Well, best of luck in your secondary data search, and I'll be following up with you all in a few days. So have a great week, everyone. Bye.